wall. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our guest, Elaine Culbertson. Elaine, thank you so much for spending your day with us. And we really appreciate this, this time and your presentation. I'd like to forward this at this time to Sue-Ann for a special prayer. Thank you, Sue-Ann.
It is a Kaddish, which is said, it's a prayer for the dead. And it's a traditional prayer that you say in mourning of people in your family and people in general who have passed away, who've meant something to you. So it's in English. At the rising sun and its going down, we remember them. At the blowing of the wind and in the chill of the winter, we remember them. At the opening of the buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them. At the blueness of the skies and the warmth of the summer, we remember them. At the rustling of the leaves and the beauty of the autumn, we remember them. At the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember them. As long as we live, they too shall live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them. When we have decisions that are difficult to make, we remember them. When we have joy we crave to share, we remember them. When we have achievements that are based on theirs, we remember them. For as long as we live, they too will live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. So, for those who don't know, I'm Jewish. So I wanted to tell you a little bit and give a nice introduction to Elaine, to kind of tell you where she came from, where I came from, and how this whole thing began. So growing up in the 60s and 70s, I hung around with a lot of kids whose parents and grandparents had numbers tattooed on their arms. Being Jewish, I knew what that meant. The questions raced through my mind, but at that point, you didn't know how they felt, so you kind of didn't say very much about it. The questions that I had, I wasn't sure if they would be offensive. I didn't know if they would appreciate them. I have extended family who were in the camps in the Warsaw ghettos and lived through the violence and the death that were the uprisings. But meeting and getting to know the families post-Holocaust was always a solemn meeting because I had sadness in my heart for their experiences. Some of the families wore the word numbers as a message of never again, and others covered the numbers because they wanted to forget and not be stared at. I, as a young child, never knew how to approach this. As an adult, I visited Auschwitz and Birkenau with my daughter in an effort to give her a better understanding of the camps. It was an experience that we'll never forget. This is why I'm passionate about the presentations that Elaine creates and gives us and gives to various groups throughout the country. I'm grateful that Fran brought her to us and we were able to collaborate to bring the history here. For those of you who were fortunate enough to attend the presentation 2 years ago, Elaine needs no introduction. While COVID forced us to skip last year, her presentation resonated and stuck with us as if it was yesterday. Elaine's personal experience with Holocaust survivors gives her a unique look into how the Holocaust affected generations after its end. Because the Holocaust was so long ago and because the remaining survivors are now in their 90s, the only way to keep the history alive and to make sure we are acutely aware of events that led up to those atrocities is to educate people who never learned about it and continue discussions for those who learned about it years ago. 36-year veteran teacher and director of curriculum and instruction, the chair of the Pennsylvania Holocaust Educational Council, the executive director of the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Their Descendants, the program director of the Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Teachers Program, is to name only a few of her accomplishments. Elaine has also authored chapters in books on the Holocaust, teaching methods, and is an active lecturer throughout the country. Elaine works with teachers and students to connect the events of the past with the genocides of today. We're lucky to have someone so notable and experienced to share her personal stories with us. We say, never again. History matters. Please welcome Elaine Culbertson.
Thank you for the invite, and thank you for remembering a presentation from 2 years ago and wanting to hear more. So why are we telling this story all these years later, and why this week in particular? Yesterday was Holocaust Remembrance Day, or as it's called in Israel, Yom HaShoah, the day of the Holocaust. In Israel, traffic stops. Everyone gets out of their cars, everyone stops working, they stand at attention while a siren blows at midday to remember the victims of the Holocaust. We don't do that in the United States, of course not. We don't have that kind of population, but we certainly did have survivors that came to us after the war, now children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of survivors. Some people yesterday lit a yellow candle in memory of those who had perished, perhaps of one person, perhaps in honor of all of them. But there's a reason that these stories keep echoing. We say never again, but it seems like all over again. The rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Asian sentiment, the fact that there's this rise in nationalism where people are saying bad things about people that don't belong to the group that they belong to, all of this is connected, and all of this is reminiscent of what happened during the Holocaust. But rather than speak in general terms, I want to speak about a family, and in particular about one person, because this story is very personal to me. This is the story of my mother. Some of you have heard part of it 2 years ago. I'm assuming you might remember a little bit, but I'm going to refresh your memories. But let me just say that there's a new element here, an element of surprise, because in my travels around the country, something happened to me on a day when I was giving a talk about my mother's experiences that has changed my life forever. And I'm happy to share that with you. My belief in teaching about the Holocaust is that it's very hard for people to think about millions of victims, but people can connect when you talk about a family, and in particular, one victim. So I'm going to talk about one victim here, but I do want to say that the Holocaust wasn't an accident. It happened because it was allowed to happen. In fact, not only was it allowed to happen, it was legalized discrimination. The laws changed, the leader invoked hatred, and people were given license to behave in terrible, terrible ways. Sometimes there had been anti-Semitism before that, but now it was the law of the land in Germany, and eventually the law of the land all across Europe. I want to talk about my mother in particular. The picture on the left is my mother as a little girl. The only reason that this picture exists is because it was sent to America before the war. My mother had nothing left after the war, but this picture with my grandmother's handwriting on the back of it was sent to my grandmother's brothers before the war. On the right, you see a more current picture of my mother. She's no longer with us, but I think you can see the resemblance, the eyes in particular. A little bit of geography. The arrow points to a small town in Poland where my mother was born. Her family had lived there for a very long time before her birth in 1926. I'm using this map which comes from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, to show you borders. At the time that my mother was a child, her town was in Poland. Now, if I tried to visit it, it would be in a completely different country called Belarus. At one point, it was part of Germany. So borders changed, but people pretty much remain the same. And you'll see what I mean by that when we go a little further. So here's the actual bigger picture. My mother and her older sister, Frania. My mother is Dora. At the time this picture was taken, my mother was about 3, her sister close to 5. Why they're wearing Santa Claus suits, I don't know. They were a Jewish family. But my mother explained to me that these were very expensive outfits trimmed in fur, that they were taken to the photographer's studio to have these portraits taken. The only picture I have of my grandmother was given to her brother, who is seated in this picture. And my mother is the little girl, her sister Frania, the bigger girl. Again, this picture was brought to America by my Uncle Eli, actually my mother's Uncle Eli, my great Uncle Eli. Had he not brought it, there would be no picture of my grandmother in existence. Again, now there's a little brother in the family. This is my mother's brother, William. Every boy in their family was named William after a particular grandfather. So I think this picture was taken in about 1930. I'm not certain. Again, it was mailed to the United States. The children were in a photographer's studio. I want to emphasize that they lived a normal childhood. They took piano lessons, they took French lessons, they went to public school, they went to summer camp, they went skiing and ice skating, they rode bicycles. My grandfather owned a bakery. It was a successful enterprise. The family did not really lack for anything. In fact, if my grandfather could have predicted the future, he might have been able to save everyone in the family, because he certainly would have been able to buy passage for them to America. However, nobody had that ability. And even when things started to become threatening in the middle to late 1930s, that was happening in Germany. And my family lived in Poland. They never believed that what was happening in a different country was going to come and infect their country. That doesn't mean that there wasn't anti-Semitism. There was, but they never thought about it becoming institutionalized, government-backed anti-Semitism. That's a whole different story. In 1939, my mother's town was handed over to the Russians in a pact between Germany and Russia. And then in 1941, it became part of Germany, and the roundups and ghettoization began. My grandparents were forced to move out of their house and give it over to a Christian family. My grandfather's bakery was taken over. He had no way to make a living. They moved in with other members of their family. Still, everything was all right as far as they were concerned, because there was a belief among the Jews in particular that this too would pass, that things would go back to normal. So entrenched was this belief that my grandmother actually had a baby in 1941. There is no picture of her, a little baby that they named Judith. They still believed that life was going to go back to normal. However, at the end of January in 1943, you can see what is going to happen. Jews in their town were going to board trains not knowing where they were going, but they were going to Auschwitz. Now, let me back up a little bit because the baby Judith deserves some mention here. In late 1942, when things really started to heat up, my grandfather approached one of the workers in his bakery, a man named Wally, and asked if perhaps he might take the baby Judith, who was about a year and a half, almost 2 years old at that point. He might take the baby and take her to his home in a little village and raise her. And when things cooled down a little bit, if he would bring her back. Wally agreed. He was a trusted employee. He understood what the family was going through. So my grandparents gave up their baby girl only for about 3 or 4 days because my grandmother cried so bitterly at the thought of losing her baby that my grandfather arranged to have little Judith brought back. This, in fact, sealed her fate. And when it was time to go to the trains, as this is a picture of, this is not a picture of my family necessarily, this is a stock photo of what was going on. But when it was time to go to the trains, my grandfather, my mother and her older sister, Frania, her younger brother, William, all went into one car in one of these trains, and my grandmother and the baby Judith into another car. Upon arrival in Auschwitz, and I'll just give you a little bit of foretelling here. Upon arrival in Auschwitz, my grandmother, the baby Judith, and my mother's little brother, William, were killed instantly. They were sent to the gas chambers. So here are the Jews boarding the trains. There were about 100 people to a train car, excuse me. And there was no facility here. People urinated and defecated where they stood. There was a pail of water, which was used up very quickly. There were people who died inside the train cars. People who were so anxious that they had panic attacks, heart attacks, etc. No one knew where they were headed. Now you might say, why didn't they know? Wasn't this publicized? Remember, we're talking about a different time, a time when the best source of information might have been a radio, but this country was already under German control. And unless you had the kind of radio that could get news from England, you didn't know what was going on. Certainly the newspapers were not giving any information. Telephones, not really. So this is a time when people were really in the dark about what was going on. Let me have my mother actually tell you what happens when my grandfather decides to escape from the train.
My father at that time was, I wouldn't say mad, but maybe he's 39, maybe he's 38 years old. Very tall, nice guy. And everybody said to him, Itzhak, why are you standing? Take a few and jump out. If they kill us all, is it going to be all right already? So my father looked at us all. And I don't know, my father would have never done anything like this, never. And he took out something from his pocket, like, I don't even know what it was, a silver dollars or golden dollars or whatever it was. And he gave this to me and my sister. And he said, I'm going to jump out. So remember, if we survive, we're going to come back to the village where Wally lives. Wally was the main worker that went to the oven. He was like our accountant. He was everything, like he was just like a person that lived with us for many, many, many years together. And I said, Daddy, where are you gonna go? Me and my sister. and mother and the boy. But you know, at that time, I guess you cannot say what happens into your head. They jumped out. How they jumped out, I will never know. And right away, you heard shooting. They jumped out 4 people. And you know, like the windows in those trains are narrow, very narrow. How we went through, I will never know. And the train goes so fast, and we heard shooting. But to tell you the truth, 2 people had survived. They jumped on both sides of the train. 2 people were killed and 2 people survived. And the people that survived, I saw them. And I said, well, where did my papa jump? He said he jumped from the same train at the same time from the other side. And he got killed probably. But still, you know, my mind and everything, my whole life in Birkenau, in Auschwitz, in Ravensbrück, I still had that little one dream that maybe he's alive. And that's what kept me going.
The trains were taking them to a place called Auschwitz. You can see that the tracks leading to Auschwitz, there were many, and it was an interesting spot because there were different size train tracks all over Europe. But for some reason, Auschwitz could accommodate all of the different width trains. And so the Nazis picked this particular spot to build their camp. At first, just a POW camp, but eventually a death camp. And so this is a photo of these train tracks. And you'll note that my mother says that she hoped for all the time that she was in Auschwitz that her father was alive, because she's going to know for certain about the fate of other people in her family. He's the only one that might have survived. So from this small town that I pointed out to you on the map, there were 1,265 Jews that arrived on this particular day, February the 2nd, 1943. Now, there were 3 days of transports from their town, but this is the day that my mother's transport arrived. How do I know this? Because of the number on her arm. The records were so meticulous that the number tattooed on her arm allowed me to investigate what day she arrived. In that transport, there were 35 children under the age of 4. One of those was the girl that would have been my aunt, Judith. There were 60 children aged 4 to 10. One of those was the boy that would have been my Uncle William. After the selection, 254 men and 105 women were checked into the camp. 866 people were gassed on arrival. In that group, my grandmother, what would have been my aunt, and my uncle. Only my mother and her sister from her immediate family were not killed immediately. So here's some more of my mother.
How are you identifying? I was in Birkenau, while they were shaving us, and we also got the number. We were already 33,000 people. And this mark is for the Jewish people. This is half of a Magen David. Because there were other prisoners there. They were prisoners of politicians, they were gay, they were all kinds of people were there, but mostly they were Jewish. All of them were Jewish. I remember there came a French train. We saw a bride that was still dressed as a bride with her veil and her dress. And I guess her whole family dressed so beautifully, and they took them straight to the guest chamber.
I included this clip. All of these clips come from the Shoah Foundation, from an interview that my mother gave in 1996. But I included this clip in particular because my mother told me this story about the bride one day when we were out walking. I don't know what brought it up. I don't know why she had never told me before or what provoked her to tell me that day. A bride coming off of the train, still dressed in her wedding gown. And my mother said two things ran through her mind. The first one was, people are still getting married? Because she was living in the universe of Auschwitz, which was striped uniforms, starvation, brutal work, cold, mud, death all around you, the smell of the crematoria and the gas chambers. And here comes a bride. And the second thing that my mother said was, that girl does not know where she has landed, because this is a terrible place. And the bride dressed in white, a symbol of hope for the future. There was no hope in Auschwitz. I took this photo when I was in Birkenau. Birkenau is the death camp part of Auschwitz. I took this photo just to illustrate. This was the latrine. This is the bathroom. And I remember working with students, and one of the students said to me, where's the toilet paper? Where's the separation between the holes? And I just looked at this young person and said, this is how it was. This was not a luxury hotel. And you could not go to the latrine at any time you wanted. You could go when your group went. This is an important piece because my mother and her sister were put on a detail to work in a quarry carrying rocks. Now, these two girls, my mother 16 at the time, her sister 17 and a half, almost 18, they had never done any physical labor like this in their lives. They were becoming emaciated from lack of food and proper nutrition. They were out in the cold, in thin uniforms, with no socks, in wooden shoes, because everything had been taken away from them. Their heads were shaved, there was no protection, and they were sent to this detail. And this particular detail is going to be problematic for my mother and her sister, but I'll let her tell the story. This kettle figures very importantly, and I just was able to find a picture of this kettle recently.
And this particular day started out right away with a train. And like this, sometimes they used to sit down somewhere and like talk. And like we had a little time for ourselves, you know, to stand and relax a little bit. This time it was just impossible. From far away, they kept on saying, we see that you are not working. We see that you are not working. And the girls were thin, dressed very poorly, very thin. The weather was cold. The wooden shoes, you know, without socks, without stockings, without anything. It was an awful day. And at 12 o'clock, they brought down the soup. The soup they used to bring in the big barrels. And we worked like in a valley. And the soup they used to live on top where they go through like on, and they left there the two big, what do you call it? It's like, they look like garbage cans with the soup. But they were closed up, you know, it should. And he picked out a few girls to go up and bring the soup down. And of course, he picked out my sister and another few girls. And the drop was very slippery because it rained and it snowed and everything. and they like fell without think together, and the hot soup started spilling on them, and they were burning. By the time they came down, they were burned, their faces, their hands, everything, and there was no soup in the barrels anyway. So he took the two girls, my sister and the other girl, and he said, look what you did. They won't have any soup till 9 o'clock this evening. And he said, well, we have to do something about it. And he took out the rifle, and with the butt of the rifle, he killed them both. And then he looked at them. He was not more than 17 years old. And he looked at them and he said, you know what? She is so young and so beautiful. She was not ready to die yet. He said it in German. So another girl understood better. Said, well, why did you do it? Said, well, if I'm not going to do it, somebody else will do it. What's the difference? None of you will go out of here alive. You will be all dead. This is the plan. This cleaning up and that all doing things is just for a while it lasts. Later on, when there is no other work to be done, you all will be killed.
This is an important point. While my mother's sister was alive and they could share memories of home, talk about what might the future hold for them, perhaps their father was alive, it kept her alive and it sustained both of them. But when her sister was killed in front of her, she lost all hope. And she thought about going to the electrified fence, that surrounded the camp. But she was stopped from doing that by some friends, some women that she had not known before, but who were living in the same barracks with her, and who took her under their wing and kept her from killing herself. People who showed her love, even though they were felt as hopeless as she did. And this is the miracle that I'm going to tell you about a little bit later in the story. So my mother does survive Auschwitz. She is taken on the death march out of Auschwitz in January of 1945. She's marched a far distance, taken to another camp called Ravensbrück in Germany, and then to another camp, and eventually she is liberated. But if you remember what she said, her father had told her that if they survive, if any of them survive, they should go back to the town where Wally lived, the one who was the baker in their bakery, the one who had offered to take her little sister Judith, but had brought her back. So now this is what Dora chooses to do, to go back to Poland to see if anyone else has survived.
To Pruzhany, to our camp, a friend of mine said, why don't you go to the guy that worked, that took once your baby? And he brought it back, but go to him. So he arranged a wagon and a horse. You know, people are very good. As a rule, people are wonderful. They are good. And we went there, and I knocked on the door. We lived in a little village. And he saw me. And, you know, he started praying. He says, Dora, but they didn't call me Dora, they called me Drea. Drea, what are you doing here? Where did you come from? I mean, this is from 1943, beginning, this is 1945, almost by the end. I said, what can I tell you, Ronnie? I don't even know where to begin and what to do. So he takes me on his side and he says to me, I don't want you to do that. We don't know what's going on. They opened all the Jewish houses. They took everything out. The government is not steady. I want you to know that your mother has 2 brothers in America. It's this where I want you to go. Go there. I said, was my father here maybe? My father jumped from the train and said, nobody was here. Nobody. I just wanted to go away from here. You and your friends, everybody, just leave the city and go away from here. I said, we don't have any money. We don't have nothing. We don't even have food. So he says, I'll give you whatever I have. I'll give you potatoes. I'll give you some pasta or whatever. And just try to take us and get away from here. First, you go away to Poland. From there, that you have organizations and you have places and you come to the right place. And this is what we did.
And the reason he says go back to Poland is that their town has now moved into Belarus at the end of the war. Poland is redivided in a different way. So since Mom was a citizen of Poland before the war, she has to go back there in order to be able to emigrate anywhere. So my mother goes back to Poland and she meets this young man and they fall in love. In fact, this young man and his brother marry my mother and her best friend, and they have a double wedding. We always said, so why did you do that? And they said, because we didn't have money to pay the rabbi twice. So my mother and her best friend who survived the war, and my father and his brother are married on the same day. And this is a picture of them in Poland after the war. And if you remember, Wally said, you have 2 uncles in America, go to America. So the young marrieds are still in Poland. They begin to participate in Memorial Day parades for their towns and for the Jews. This is my mother right here. I'm pointing to her with the armband. And she has recovered now. This is my mother's best friend, who is now her sister-in-law. And this is a memorial parade in 1947 for the people of their town. My mother makes contact with her 2 uncles in America through the Red Cross and through HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, which is in fact still working today to bring immigrants to the United States and to help them. And because my mother is now pregnant with me in 1949, my uncles pay for my mother to fly to America. And this is her ticket to fly from Frankfurt, Germany to New York to LaGuardia Airport. Now, this was a pretty big deal. My mother was 7 months pregnant. They didn't pay for my father to fly to America. He came by boat about a week and a half later. So my mother comes on her own. At the last minute, as they're dividing up the paperwork, my father forgets to give her all of the appropriate papers that she needs, and she ends up landing in America and having to spend the night in Ellis Island because her uncles have to swear out a bond that she will not become a burden to the American government. So after a 24-hour flight, she is imprisoned again and has to wait until the morning before she can go with her uncles. She had only ever met that one uncle, Uncle Eli. The other uncle, Uncle Abe, had gone to America years before, had never seen my mother except in photos. So this is who takes her in. And some of the paperwork I just have here, the paperwork that you needed in order to immigrate. She had permission from the Army to travel to the United States. And then when they came here, they were given a US Citizen's Handbook in Polish, which I still have, because they wanted to become citizens as quickly as possible. So here is her petition for naturalization. She wants to become a citizen in 1954, so 5 years after she came to the United States. And here is her naturalization paper. This was a prized possession in our family. My father has one too. And then, because her education had been interrupted, she was in high school when the war began. She decides that she will go to night school, and get the equivalent of a 6th grade education. My father, who had been in college at the time, has one of these as well because his education was interrupted as well. And then here's a picture of them, a more recent photo. Now, the story would be that they had 2 children who were successful, and then there were 3 grandchildren. Everything was fine. Except I am invited at one point to come to Milwaukee and to tell the same story that I'm telling you now, which ended right at the point of the pictures of my mother and father. And one night I am there telling my story. And sitting in the audience right in front of me are a couple, a husband and wife, and they keep whispering to each other during the story. And I am so offended by this that they're talking in front of me. Remember, I was a teacher for a long time, that I'm thinking about stopping the presentation and saying, could you please stop talking? But they come up to me afterwards, and the man says to me, can I talk to you? And I want to say, well, don't stop talking now. You've been talking the whole time during my presentation. But there's something about him, a sweetness about him. So I say, sure. And he says, your mother's story is very much like my mother's story. I said, oh, really? You're a son of survivors? He said, yes. He said, and they're just very, very similar. The places that they're from and the dates and everything like that. And so we start to put some things together. His mother's hometown and my mother's hometown were about 100 kilometers apart from each other, which is about 60 miles. Okay, and so I've highlighted them for you. They both end up in Auschwitz, Birkenau. Both of them are named Dora. Okay, I think a lot of people were in Auschwitz. Then he says to me, and we lived in Brooklyn too. Where did you live? And I tell him that we lived at 397 Georgia Avenue, and he tells me that they lived on the 400 block of Georgia Avenue. He calls his brother to make sure that that's correct. And I said, you lived on the next block from us? Do you think that our parents knew each other? Now, I included this picture. This is my first birthday party. That's my mother in the front there holding me with a birthday hat on, and some of her friends, all of whom are Holocaust survivors. None of these are this gentleman's parents, but that's who my parents' friends were. And then as I am leaving Milwaukee, he contacts me and gives me a book that his mother wrote about her experiences. And this is him handing me the book. And I think I really should read this book one day. And I go home to Philadelphia. And one day I pick up his book and I start to read it. And I go, the coincidences are really very strange. His mother, Dora Yablonik, Russek, arrived in Auschwitz on January 23rd, 1943. My mother arrived on February 2nd, 1943. Look at the numbers. They're only, about 1,500 apart from each other. Very interesting. And this is in Auschwitz itself, where the Jews would have been brought in the train cars. He tells me, and as I'm reading, that his mother was in a particular barracks. And it turns out that our mothers were in the same barracks together. Now remember, I've never met this gentleman before. I did not ever know anything about him until that night in Milwaukee. Here's a picture of what the accommodations were like. This is the places that they were sleeping. Wooden slats in a cement bunk. If they were lucky, there was some straw or hay there. Never any blankets or anything like that. And you wanted to be on the top bunk for a lot of reasons, but one of the most important was that a lot of people had dysentery while they were there. And you can imagine what was going on here as things were pouring down from above. Here's a little interview of my mother. I'm hoping we can get this to play.
It was like a helping hand. Everybody tried to encourage everybody else. The older ones tried to do it to the younger. By older, I mean the 25, 27-year-old looked to us like we are, children, and they are the older. So they tried to encourage us to try to keep clean, to try to be good to each other, try not to steal the food from each other. And we always paired us like two together. If we got a portion of bread, we ate one in the morning and we kept one. Otherwise, we put together both our portions. We ate one together and we kept one. To save. I was with a girl that was not from my town, and she was from Grodno, in Poland, and she was in our ghetto. Grodno, 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 and her name was Dora too.
Her name was Dora too, and she was from Grodno. This is this gentleman's mother. They shared a bunk, my mother and his mother. Now, how did we find this out? A very strange occurrence. My mother had always told me that when she was in Auschwitz, she slept, after her sister died, she slept on the same bunk with another woman named Dora, whose uncle was an actor on the Yiddish stage in America. And that he had written this song called Papyrosen, which means cigarettes. And my mother would sing this song. And she said that this Dora, the other Dora, would say to her, "You'll see, we'll get to America, we'll live, we'll get to America, and my uncle will be very good to us. He lives in Brooklyn, so that's where we'll go. And he's rich because he's a famous star. He'll take care of us." And so when I opened this book that Stephen, this gentleman, had given me, and suddenly there were pictures of this man who was this singer who had written this book, this song, Papyrosen, I said, oh no, Stephen's mother and my mother were together in Auschwitz. This is unbelievable. What are the chances? Just a little sample of the song. And now, Stephen unearths his mother's Shoah interview. And this is what she says.
It went on the knee till March of 1943. At that time, I resigned from life. I was very ill, very sick. I was burning like a fire. My friends from my city, we try to stay together, stick together, always. They help each other. They dragged me in the camp. And I made up my mind that time that I'm going to no more go to work. And if you don't go to work, that's the crematorium. But I didn't care anymore. That new higher rank assessment was there. And the revere was the hospital of the camp, was next to the Block 25. And he told some of the SS, said, let's stop. And we stopped. And they called, and they looked over, and they said, and they came to me, and they said, what's wrong with you? I could have told them I'm boiling, I have God knows what. And the moment I said, I promise you to. So me, in another Dora, from Pruzhany, not far from Yablokoff, really, I met her. I meet her every winter she comes to Florida. And two girls from Czechoslovakia. They called out the local district, the eldest from the Revere, and they took me out in the Revere. I was there 6 weeks.
So I hope you understood what she's saying, that my mother and two other girls carried this Dora to the hospital and saved her life. And all of a sudden, we have these amazing connections, that they shared a bunk, that they shared their food, and then that my mother helped to save her mother's life. So what did it mean? I found this quote, and I think it really is the essence of this story. You had to have a partner to take care of you and of you to take care of him, a partner who you could organize food with and would share food with. You had to have someone to help, because if you stood by yourself, you couldn't survive. You didn't survive. There were those people who didn't want to share anything. They were always afraid to share a piece of bread. And those were the people who went first. So this is just a trajectory of where the Doras were and how they were, where they were together, and when they were separated, one went to one DP camp and one to another DP camp. They did know each other in Brooklyn. They did stay in contact, but not in a very close way, because we as the children never knew each other. But they would meet each year in Florida. And then when I started thinking about it, I remember that my mother told me a story once when she was in Florida in the winter, that she had been in a dress shop and gone into the back, into the dressing room to try something on. She had left my father in the front of the store. And at that point, when she wanted my father to see what the outfit looked like, she called out to him to ask him to come back and look at her. And a woman in the next booth said, "Dora, is that you?" And it was the other Dora. She recognized her voice. And I remember the night that my mother called to tell me this, because she was so thrilled. She hadn't seen Dora Russek in a number of years. And this is where they reconnected in Florida. So here are our mothers, the two families, and the story of how the friendship of two people who survived these horrible atrocities actually comes together again when one daughter, me, and one son, Stephen, meet each other in, of all places, Milwaukee, where I don't live, when I'm on a tour talking about my mother's story. And that's the end. So here we are, the two Doras children.
Presentation was quite fascinating. I just have one question. How old were you when you became aware of your family's history?
So the first thing that I understood was when I was about 3. My mother has a tattoo on her arm. And 2021 with so many tattoos is a very different time than 1952, when very few people had tattoos. I'll joke and say only sailors had tattoos. Certainly women did not. And I asked my mother what the number on her, I didn't know even what numbers were. I asked what was on her arm, and she told me that it was her telephone number. And it's an ugly, ugly tattoo. It's crude looking. And I was so scared that the telephone company was going to come and put our number on my arm, that I memorized our telephone number when I was 3. Now, fast forward a number of years, when my son was about the same age, he was sitting with my mother. He called her Bubby. And he said, Bubby, numbers. And she said, that's what some bad people did to me a long time ago. Because she and I had talked about this since then, you know, when I was old enough to really articulate and think about. So I knew a lot. And I was one of those kids who kind of hung around the table when people told stories. So I knew an awful lot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Elaine, I have another question.
Of course.
You did your mother's experience give you an extra sensitivity to people and humanity?
I hope you can hear that in the way I give this presentation, that I would hope to say yes. Very sensitive to immigrants, very sensitive to the other, to people who don't speak the language, to people who have undergone trauma. You know, they say that trauma is transmitted in the genes. And there's a lot of studies in Israel of second generation, like myself, and what has happened for them in their emotional experiences, and whether it's even transmitted down further than that. They're now saying that it can be transmitted into the 5th generation. So I would say yes. I was very conscious of language. I didn't speak English as a little kid. My parents didn't speak English right away. So I didn't really learn to speak English till I was old enough to go out to play with other children. I had heard it on television, but I didn't have anybody to speak to. So I was very conscious of all of that. Mostly of what do you do to fit in? How do you fit in? How do you take this experience, which I didn't even know was an experience when I was a child? How do you take this and make use of it in a positive way, which is, I think, why I became a teacher.
Thank you.
I have a few other questions in the chat box, Elaine. This one's from Terry. She asked, do you know why your mom was one of the ones who survived? Did you and her ever have that conversation through the years?
Yeah, luck, totally luck. And when you speak with survivors, and there's so few of them left, but if you can read their, their memoirs or their stories or whatever, most of them will tell you it's absolutely luck. Why my aunt was chosen on that day to bring the soup cans down and not my mother. And there are so many other stories. I mean, it would take me a year to sit here and tell you everything that happened to her. Why didn't she die? She was just as starved, just as sick as anybody else. Completely luck.
Any other questions from the over 80 participants?
I have a question. I just want to say here, this is the second time I've had the pleasure of listening to your presentation, Elaine, and I just thank you so much. It's just very powerful.
Thank you for listening.
That guys, technical difficulties, but thanks so much for sharing your story. But my question for you was, when you first started sharing your mother's story and your family's story, were you at all scared, or like, what was your thought process and your overall process with that?
So I have to tell you that I started doing this when I was a teacher, and it kind of burgeoned from that. And the reason I was doing it as a teacher is that I heard an anti-Semitic remark in my classroom. And when I kind of confronted the student who had said something, he said, I didn't know you were Jewish. I said, that doesn't mean that you can get away with that remark. It isn't that you offended me. It's why are you saying that? And it went from there. So I wasn't necessarily scared. I just needed to figure out, how do you get people to think about the impact of their words? And so, you know, a remark that's made against Black people isn't okay if there are no Black people in the room. It's just not okay. And that's how I felt about this. So I actually started talking about this a long time ago, and then I kind of tailored the presentation because it seemed to me, as I said at the beginning, nobody wants to hear about 6 million people dead. They want to know what happened to a person or a family. So I was sure that hearing the story would make a difference. I just needed to figure out how to put it together.
Thank you.
Olu, go ahead. I think you had a question.
Actually, it's not a question. I just wanted to say thank you, Elaine. And the last time you had a presentation, I remember I told you, I said, actually, the Blacks have gone through a lot, but hearing this story gave me this mindset that every culture, every background has had their own experiences too. And how can we heal from this? By understanding, even if I've not heard what you have to say, I mean the other person, but I need to let myself know that definitely you came from somewhere. I mean, probably your ancestors or whatever it is, but they had their experiences too. So we need to heal by allowing ourselves, and I just want to give kudos also to the management of this organization for the effort they're putting in place to ensure that diversity is something that spreads all around, and to ensure that we have that accurate and sincere value for each and every, for one another in this organization. So I just want to say thank you again for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I remember you. I remember that we spoke.
Yes.
You know, you're talking about diversity, but I kind of want to think about it as humanity. We're all human. And anybody can kind of put themselves into the story and say, so what if this happened to someone I know, or what if it happened to me? There are people who do bad things in this world, and the victims need to be heard, and we need to learn from that.
I have another question from Katrina. Do you find that other survivors look for outlets to tell their stories as well?
So, for a long time, the survivors, particularly in America, didn't talk. And I'll give you a for instance. So imagine my mother, who comes to this country. She's 22 years old. She has a baby 2 months after she arrives. That's me. And we live on a street in Brooklyn, and somebody invites her to a Tupperware party. And she's very excited to be included. And she goes, and she has this number on her arm, and someone asks her about the number at the party. And the hostess of the party says, please don't talk about that. This is America. That happened there. This is here. That happened then. This is now. Please don't ruin my party. Now, if you are given feedback like that, then you don't talk because you think it's too traumatic. People don't want to hear it. It's too ugly. It's too sad. There's a level of guilt that people have. Why it wasn't more done? Why wasn't it done sooner, etc. So they stop telling their stories. I know second generation folks like myself who have never heard their parents' stories because their parents just said, I'm never talking about this again. So there was this real reluctance to reveal it. I would say that the breakthrough came when Adolf Eichmann was on trial in 1960 in Israel. When he was captured, he was one of the engineers of this death camp situation. And his trial in Israel was like the floodgates opened and people started talking about what had happened to them. So in 1960, I was 11 years old, and suddenly people's stories were being heard. And so that's what happened. But still, there are probably other survivors who have kept it completely under wraps, could not mention it, thought better than they thought it would traumatize their children. to tell you the truth, I think it traumatizes you more to know that something is wrong, but you don't know what it is. Because you can't have lived through these kinds of things and not be scathed in some way. Something has touched you that is not normal and has changed you somehow.
Palmer, and I just want to tell you thank you very, very much for presenting today. I'm a historian, and I watch, I think it's AME when they talk about the Holocaust and talk about when you have so many Jewish families discussing things, and my heart just really goes out, and I just want to say, as a person that's a historian and watches that show quite often, thank you very, very much, because I'm hearing a live person talking about it versus seeing it always on TV. So thank you.
You're welcome. I'm always thrilled that people hear this and that it touches them. So thank you.
I also wanted to say thank you. I think it's so hard because as people, we're losing the people that are left and to tell their story firsthand. So the fact that you carry it on and you tell it is really beautiful. And it's so important because, I mean, I had two uncles that were in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II, never talked about it. And it's like you lose that firsthand, get bits and pieces, but to be able to tell a story that's so rich and so powerful, I think it's a beautiful thing. So thank you so much.
You are very welcome. And, you know, second generation and now third generation needs to pick up the ball and not let the story get lost.
Another question in the chat box from Leanne. Do you have any children? Will someone be able to continue to tell this story for more generations?
Yes, I do. And just like me, I have a son who has absorbed a lot of the stories and who is particularly interested in this history, his family's history. And I think, you know, when we were talking about this, recording myself telling the story is important because now we have this advantage. I mean, think how much richer this story is because you actually heard my mother speaking. You know, in 1955, we would not have been able to have a video of my mother telling her story firsthand. And how much that impacted me to be able to watch that video and to rewatch it multiple times to completely piece together everything that I wanted to say. So the interviews with survivors, the interviews with second generation, all of these, all of the programs that are available now, and the books. I'm working on a book about my mother and me and what the impact of this has been on me, not just her story, but what it's like to hear a story, like the story of the bride coming off of the train. What it's like to hear a story like that. How do you process that as a young person? How do you not become filled with hatred for the perpetrators? You know, how do you move past that and look for not the silver lining, because it isn't that, but how do you look for the way to take that story and tell it to someone else and hope that it makes a difference in their lives?
Did you want to close the meeting?
Yes, I'd like to close this fantastic experience on behalf of the communities of Dongonella and Divine Providence and our Diversity Leadership Committee, Elaine, for such a thoughtful, meaningful, and informative presentation. And just like 2 years ago when you presented here, you have once again left us all tremendously enriched. But not only do you enrich us, you touch us in a profound way emotionally. And at times I was simply overwhelmed emotionally by your story. And if I and others are feeling the same way, I can imagine the price you must pay emotionally for retelling, remembering, and recalling all this. So I want to thank you for that as well. In telling your mother's story, you give witness, to paraphrase Eli Wiesel, by remembering, you give witness to those who died in the Holocaust, those who are alive, and those who are unborn, namely the future generations. I also take from your story, not only is it a personal and moving one, it's also a reminder of our collective responsibility, Jews and non-Jews alike, to confront anti-Semitism and hatred and intolerance whenever we encounter it, so that something like the Holocaust never occurs again. And as you mentioned in your opening remarks, given the current climate of increased anti-Semitism, racism, anti-immigrant feeling, it's even more important to be extra vigilant. So I thank you again. God bless you and your work, and I hope you can come back soon. And just a special thanks to those who helped put this program together. You obviously, Sue Ann, Steve, Joannis, and Charlene. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you all. And you're right, Fran. It does have its toll, but if that's all that it is a toll, it's an important price I'm willing to pay. So thanks. All the best to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you.